We're in John chapter 9, and Jesus has just healed a man that was born blind. He spat on the ground, he made some mud, put it on his eyes, and told him to go and wash. And the man was healed. We're now looking at the consequences of that healing, and particularly what the Pharisees thought about it. I'm reading to you from John chapter 9 and verse 13. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. And therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. "He put mud on my eyes," the man replied, "and I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God. He doesn't keep the Sabbath." But others asked, "How can a sinner do such miraculous signs?" And so they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened." The man replied, "He's a prophet." The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, and so they sent for his man's parents. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know that he was born blind. But how he can now see or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. And that was why his parents said, "He's of age, ask him." A second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." And he replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was once blind, but now I see." And then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses, and we know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Well, that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. No one has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And to this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. The aftermath of a miraculous sign is one where you would expect someone to hail Jesus as being at least a great prophet, certainly a man of God, and yet here we find the reception is quite the opposite. The Pharisees took a strong interest in this case because, well, they must have recognized the fact that going around performing miracles, opening the eyes of the blind, is not an everyday occurrence. And they're also well aware that this is a sign of the Messiah, that the lame will walk and the blind will see. And here is someone who comes along, who makes no boast, no qualms about the fact that he is being sent from God, quite open about it. And here he is, healing the sick and opening the eyes of the blind. So naturally they want to investigate. But it's quite clear also that they've already made their minds up about this person. This is not an open and fair and honest investigation. This is the kind of investigation in which they're looking for any kind of evidence in which they can to dispute the claims of Jesus and to disprove them. It's the kind of bias that one sees very evidently with someone who has a closed mind. And there's a lesson here for us as we look and contemplate at people in the way in which they investigate matters or look at matters. There's a kind of idea of confirmation bias here, that those things which we agree with, we ask the question, how can they not be true? But for those things which we disagree with, we ask, how can they be made false? We approach things in a different kind of way, and we don't open our minds to the full account. Now, if these Pharisees had opened their minds to the possibility of this being the real Messiah, someone sent from God, then the questioning would have taken a different form. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now, the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Now, the Pharisees had very strong views on the Sabbath and how it should be kept. And it was not right to do any work at all on the Sabbath. You remember, of course, that the Ten Commandments said that the Sabbath was to be given to people for work, to avoid work. I'll read to you from Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 12. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, or your daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor the alien within your gate, so that your manservant and maidservant may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. Now, all of this is rooted in slavery and the oppression that comes from being a slave. The Hebrews, the Jews, were slaves in Egypt. They were utterly oppressed. They had to build buildings making bricks from clay, and they weren't given the full opportunity to do that without strong back-breaking work to do that constantly. It was of difficult, harsh, back-breaking work. And yet they had no break or respite from it. Day in, day out, no stop. Continuous, hard work from the moment you get up to the moment you go back to sleep again. No opportunity for rest. And that was something to continue for years and years and years. No rest, not a holiday, not even a break in the week. Here we enjoy the fact that we tend to work 5 days a week, and we have 2 days rest, where we can do our own pleasure and do our own things. Here, can you imagine a situation where you had no break, no rest, no let-up, and an intense persecution to press you, to make you do that continuous work? And if you didn't, there would be punishment and consequences. The oppressiveness of that constant regime of work, with no break at all, becomes a heavy, heavy burden on anyone. And it's recognized in the law here that the Sabbath day must be kept holy because no work is to be done on that day. Now, there are 2 ways that you can take this. You can take this as a relief to people that you shouldn't make people work on the Sabbath day. 1 day in 7, everybody should get time off. And it particularly refers to your dependents, in particular, to your son and your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, even your animals, your oxes and donkeys, even the alien within their gates, anyone who you had power or control over. They were not to be forced to work because you've experienced what that's like yourself. They deserve time off. And you must not oppress people in that continuous work. Right? So it's not just for yourself, it's to everyone. Or you can take this as a kind of a legalistic thing, that the law exists for its own sake, not for the sake of the benefit it confers on people, but for the sake of keeping the law, whether you understand it or not. You just have to do it. And that's how the Pharisees had come to take it. Any aspect of work, whatever that might be, even picking something up off the ground and carrying it for some distance, taking your animal out of a ditch, that would be considered some kind of work. Even healing someone, which is what doctors did, would be considered some kind of work. So instead of seeing the Sabbath as a benefit, it was seen as a burden, something which was oppressive and something which you had to attend to and be controlled by. It was no longer given to you as a benefit for your life and to improve your lot, but rather you were given to it in order to be able to say that you obeyed the Sabbath law. Well, that's how the Pharisees understood it. And therefore the Pharisees had asked him how he'd received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. So it was very interesting the way in which they asked him how he had received his sight. They asked him that twice, and I think there's a reason for that here. Because it was the Sabbath, because they knew it had taken place on the Sabbath when no work must be done. How did Jesus heal you? Did he do it without doing any work? Or did he actually do some work? Even if picking up your mat and walking with it is considered work for the Pharisees, so it is. It wasn't just a word that Jesus uttered and without doing any work at all. He actually did some form of primitive menial work, which was to pick up some mud and to make some dirt, to spit on it, to make some mud from it and to apply it to the person's eyes. Having gained, that's how he actually did it. I think it's at that point the Pharisees said, that's work. That's breaking the Sabbath. That is something which is not allowed. That's something which a good and holy man would not do. It's interesting to know, though, whether Jesus deliberately used this particular mechanism in order to provoke this kind of result. Hard to say whether that's the case or not, but he didn't shy away from provoking people with the truth. He put mud on my eyes, the man said, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. That's the conclusion they've drawn. He healed you, what? By making mud, by applying it to your eyes? That's a healing process. That's a work which he's done. Therefore, he has broken the Sabbath in doing this. He's therefore not from God. The logic is quite clear as far as they understand it. But it's because their understanding of the law is a strict legal one, which they have bound upon people's backs rather than made it a relief from them. But others asked, how can a sinner do such miraculous signs? And so they were divided. Pharisees were unsure how to proceed. They were the legalistic ones, saying he did some work, he's not broken the law and therefore can't be from God. That makes sense. And yet also, on the other hand, the paradox here is, how can he have cured the man through doing this act? That doesn't make any sense. How can a sinner do miraculous signs? So they're caught in this paradox. They don't know how to resolve it themselves. Finally, they turn again to the blind man. What have you got to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. The blind man said, he's a prophet. In other words, he declares him at least to be a man of God, someone from God. But the Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until he sent for the man's parents. So they're trying to solve their dilemma. They've got a dilemma which says that Jesus cannot be from God because he did work on the Sabbath, and yet he must be from God because he healed a blind man. How do you reconcile the irreconcilable? You must find a way out from it, and the way out that they found was, well, maybe they didn't really heal. We can know he's a sinner because he broke the Sabbath. Maybe he didn't really heal the man. Let's find out. Maybe the man is just telling lies. Maybe he's one of Jesus' confederates. Maybe he's a disciple who's going around spreading these kind of rumours just to be able to bolster Jesus' claim to be the Messiah. Let's get to the bottom of this, because that way we can solve our paradox by saying that, well, he's a sinner, but because he didn't even heal the man, it was just a fake. So the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. So, "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" So they wanted to find out if maybe it wasn't the right man. Maybe he wasn't blind at birth. Maybe he was able to see later on in life. Maybe it wasn't due to Jesus at all. They want to investigate that. The parents give a testimony. "We know that he's our son, so yes, this is the right man. And we also know that he was born blind. So yes, we testify to that too. He's the right man, and he has been born blind. But how he can see now, who opened his eyes, we don't know, because presumably they were not there. But also, they may have heard that Jesus was responsible for this. But so, rather than testify to Jesus, they're fearful. They are afraid. And besides which, they would only have second-hand testimony. They say, "Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself." So being of age, he must have been, over the age of bar mitzvah, where he's become as an adult. So, but his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. So, here is the real problem that the Jews really have. And that is, they had already decided. They had prejudged the issue. In other words, it doesn't really matter what evidence was presented. They had already made their minds up. And therefore they were completely unsuited to be judges in the case. In fact, any judge who has pre-made his mind up or her mind up is completely unsuited to be a judge. And any of us, if we make our mind up about things before we've heard the evidence, then we are unsuited to be a judge too. And they certainly showed themselves in that position. They were unsuited to be judges because they had predetermined the case. A good judge will only judge on the basis of the evidence. He will seek to find the facts. He's interested not in his own viewpoint, he's interested in the truth, whatever that might be. And the truth is that which corresponds to the facts, and it's the evidence which supports those facts and is the basis of those facts. But these people had no interest in that. They had already made their mind up that they could not accept Jesus as the Christ. And if anyone had said that they did accept Jesus as the Christ, even with the overwhelming evidence of him curing this man of blindness, then doesn't matter. They would be put out of the synagogue, disfellowshipped, thrown out of the church, unable to be part of the religious community. And that would be a serious matter, because all of your family ties, all of your friendships would all be broken. You'd be very much on your own and outcasts outside of the people of Israel. They'd be excommunicated. So they were afraid of that punishment. Being cancelled, essentially, is what the local terminology would be. Many people suffer from cancellation these days if they say the wrong things. And the same thing happened probably in this day when people would be cancelled by being thrown out of the synagogue. That's the same as cancellation. So that's why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." In other words, don't put us on the spot. Ask him himself. So, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind. "Give glory to God," they said. Now, it's a very solemn charge to tell the truth, and it's found in Joshua 7:19. Let me just pull that up for you, because it's got this from the footnotes of the Bible here. Joshua 7:19. Then Joshua said to Achan, "My son, give glory to the Lord and the God of Israel, and give him the praise. Tell me what you have done, and do not hide it from me." That's a solemn charge, to tell the truth, going all the way back to the time of Joshua. It's the same charge here that was invoked in this statement here. Give glory to God, they said. We know this man is a sinner. In other words, agree with us and accept that what we say is true. He replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. There's an equivocal answer here. But one thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. The facts are incontrovertible. The interpretation you put upon them, well, I leave you to put your own interpretation, basically, the man is saying, as to whether he's a sinner or whether he's a saint. But I was blind, and now I see. My parents have attested to that fact too. So we have factual evidence of a sign of God. What will you make of it? Then they asked him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And you might say, well, why are they asking the same question again? And I think it's because they're still caught in this paradox of how can someone have done good? We're confronted with the idea that here is a man who has performed a miracle and opened the eyes of the blind. How can God have blessed him when, on the other hand, he has done some kind of work on the Sabbath? How do we reconcile that? We've tried to say that, on the one hand, it's possibly not the right man. Maybe he wasn't born blind. Maybe, there was something where he gained his sight some other way. But no, they've checked that route out, and they've thoroughly found that it is the man. He was born blind, and he has been made to see in a way. Let's check out the other paradox, which we cannot solve at the moment. How did this person heal you then? Did he do it by doing some work on the Sabbath? Because if he did it by doing some work on the Sabbath, that doesn't make any sense to our rules. Moses said we mustn't do work on the Sabbath, and therefore we can't understand how this could be the case. So what did he do? Repeat it again. Let's go and get this clear. How did he open your eyes? He answered, look, I've already told you. You did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? And the reason why they want to hear it again is because they're trying to solve this paradox. But that final sting in the tail is, why do you want to hear it again? I've explained it to you very clearly. You want to do something the same? Do you want to follow him? Do you want to try the same thing for yourself? Do you want to become one of his disciples? Do you want to put into practice the things that he's doing? Are you following him? Do you want to learn how to do this miraculous feat and therefore follow Jesus Christ? To which they had then hurled insults at him. You are this fellow's disciple. We are the disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. So they're pinning their colours to the mast, and they make a strong distinction between Moses and Jesus. And they say that these two cannot be the same. They cannot be on the same side, because Moses gave us a law. The law had the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments included keeping the Sabbath, and this Jesus breaks it. They cannot be the same. They're on opposite sides of the fence. And we're on Moses' side. Which side are you on? And, in fact, we know about Moses, and we have been taught from Moses for generations. But this man, he's an upstart, he's a new person. We don't even know where he comes from. We don't know about his origins. The man says, well, that is remarkable. There's a bit of sarcasm here in that statement. You don't know where he comes from? And yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, and he listens to the godly man who does his will. No one ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Now there's a powerful refutation. There's a powerful statement. He said, you don't know where this man comes from? Well, I know where this man comes from. This man has done a good deed to me. This man has done a miraculous deed to me. He has cured blindness and given me sight that I've never had in my life before because I was born blind. He comes from God. How do I know that? Because we know that God does not listen to sinners. And only God can cure the blindness of a man blind from birth. He listens to the godly man who does his will. That's how you should know where he comes from. I know where he comes from. I understand it very well and very clearly, and so should you. Because nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. It's unprecedented. It's a miracle which has never been done before. And if this man were not from God, how could he have done that? He could do nothing. That's my view. That's my argument. That's my testimony, said the man himself who was born blind. He accepted Jesus as from God. What's the response? Well, the final words are this. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. This being steeped in sin from birth goes right the way back to the start of the miracle, because it was at the start of the miracle that the disciples asked Jesus, you remember, as they went along, this is chapter 9, verse 1, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples said, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Well, the implication is, as we said in the previous lecture, that that illness, such as blindness, was due to sin. Anything which bad occurred to you was due because you'd sinned in some way. That caused a problem with this particular case because this is a man who was born blind from birth, which meant that he couldn't have sinned unless he sinned inside his mother's womb in somehow, which is what some people have suggested, that's the only way you can understand it. And but either way, that was the fundamental teaching of the time. The fundamental teaching was in error, as Jesus points out. Nothing to do with that, says Jesus. The man was born blind for an entirely different reason. Not due to the fact that his parents sinned or he sinned. It's not that. But that was the current view. The current view of the Pharisees, the current view of the Jews, and that's why they dismissed him and his testimony at the end. You were steeped in sin from birth. Implication being that that's why you were blind. Because right from birth, even from the moment that you were born, you were a sinner. Even from the very moment that you came into the world, you were a sinner. Your parents were sinners too. This is the only way in which we understand the situation. And that's why you were blind. You were blind because you were a sinner. So why should we listen to anything that you have to say? And so they dismiss the testimony of the blind man made able to see. They dismiss the testimony of his parents. They dismiss the testimony of the miracle itself, and they dismiss the person of Jesus. But they had made up their mind to do so even before they began their investigation.